Good afternoon, beautiful people. Before we start with the official panel, let me just privatize one little moment of this panel. First of all, thank Alida, thank Jeton, thank Sasha for having me here. This is my first time in Pristina, Kosovo, and I'm fascinated by energy of the people and energy of the city. I feel so much at home that wherever I go, I just start speaking Croatian, and then when people look at me like, okay, then I switch to English, so I feel completely at home here. Thank you so much for this experience. So let me start by introducing our panelists. Well, yes, our last panelist is actually approaching us. So, Petra Nagenkögel from Austria, an author who runs the literary association ProLit in Salzburg, which has a special focus on communicating Eastern and Southeastern European literature. Carsten, Jensen, on the right, from Denmark, whom you've met yesterday, writer of literary fiction, travel biographies, essayist and political columnist. Tatjana Gustafsson, writer and translator from Sweden. Edis Galushi, Roma author, journalist and fellow translator from Kosovo. Also Daniel is also a translator, so we have two translators, some authors, translators, writers, a mix of everything. So this morning while I was preparing for this panel, I'm reading currently a book by Croatian author, Bosnian author Nagenkögel, and I stumbled upon a sentence in that book which says, "What is that time when all the most horrendous is truth?" Rat je ono vrijeme kada je sve najstrašnije istina. It is so powerful that I had to use Croatian just to reiterate it. So basically, since Russia brutally invaded Ukraine on the 24th of February 2022, the entire world has entered a very strange phase indeed. First of all, because after the 2.5 years of living in very strange conditions, living in the pandemic, immediately we woke up in the middle of the Third World War III. So I would like to start by paraphrasing the Latin saying inter arma silent leges, or we can say Musae, so for among arms the muses are silent. Because some writers say that they believe in the dignity of silence. I really do not believe in the dignity of silence, and I think that all my panelists, we are on the same front line here. Silence, as opposed to voices that need to be heard, the voices of authors, translators, writers, poets, any kinds of artists. So, Petra, I would like to start with you. So what do you think the first question would be, and all of my panelists will chip in, what is the role of Ukrainian authors, but also let's touch on the role of Russian authors as well.
Yeah, good afternoon. It's difficult for me to formulate as Austrian writer what is the role of Ukrainian and Russian writers. In fact, I cannot have an answer. I try to, as organizer for Literatura Salzburg, I try to transmit both of them. I try to invite Ukrainian authors and Russian authors. My question is how to support, and also Belarusian, because now we are forgetting
yes.
that in Belarus there is quite a difficult situation.
Yes.
And how to, I try to hear their voices, to invite them to keep in touch, to stay in touch, to stay in contact. And first of all, I think we are all shocked by these last 2 months, and we are in the middle of it.
Yes.
And we lack the distance to really analyze the situation. And so I can do, as writer and as human being, what we do as writers always, we look, we feel, and we try to find a language and a position and a form for what we look and we feel and we hear and we note. And the role of Ukrainian writers, We
in a
just
sense
spoke
for
about
us,
it.
because how much they can help us as people of letters to realize what is going on. You know.
I have the impression that they do, but in private contexts. So the people, for example, I'm very friend with Evgenia Belorusets.
Yes.
He stayed she stayed in Kiev. She has a very differentiated position. So she also sees what the Russian soldiers are bearing, for example, and. From her, I get informations I never get by the medias or by the news. So
tell us about Evgenia Belorusets writes this blog, the War Diary, and she writes about everything that happens, and it is wonderful. Just check her out.
Yeah. But there are also the other positions. For example, we just spoke about Oksana Abushko. I don't know if you read it. She published some days ago a pamphlet where she. I was really astonished and I was frightened by this text, where she derived more or less from the Russian literature, from Dostoevsky, from Tolstoy, what is happening now. So she said that always in Russian literature you can observe a certain glorification of crime. Yeah? A certain glorification of war, and so 100 years before or 200 years before we could read what happens now. So this for me is really problematic, because this is a new kind of mythology, and there we have also take our position against.
Please, would you like to chip in with any of your words, Carsten or Tatjana?
Maybe I could say something.
Yes, please.
Yeah, I also read this text of Oksana Zabushka, which is translated, famous Ukrainian writer. It was published in Times Literary Supplement, I think, originally, but it was translated into many languages. And it started a quite fierce debate also in Sweden. Can you say something like this? Is this Russophobia? What is this? But I think what she wanted to say, in her own kind of sounding crazy way, was that there is a need for decolonization of Ukrainian literature or Ukrainian culture in general. And I think it's enough just to, in my country, Sweden is a small country, I think we have one translator that can translate from Ukrainian.
Directly.
Then directly.
Wow.
Then we have Russian translators who can somehow learn to translate shorter text, poems and so on. I was together with, I also work for a translators organization in Sweden, so I'm quite interested in the subject. And I think it's part of this decolonization project that we have to also understand from our position that it's not only Russophobia. At Slavic institutions all over the world, Ukrainian language has been treated very, very poorly, or if treated at all. There is only one university in my country where you can read or study Ukrainian, while the language is not a small language. You have 40 million speakers or so on, 30 million native speakers of Ukrainian, so it's not a peripheric language. But in the Slavic world, where the Russian language is so dominating, Ukrainian language and Ukrainian culture has been under a heavy pressure during the last 150 years. So I think you have to see Oksana Zabushka's article, which was very fierce and very strange from that point of view, and try to understand also history. Another great Scandinavian or Nordic writer called Sophie Oksanen wrote another piece just a few days ago on the same subject. She's half Finnish, half Estonian, and has written a lot about the Soviet oppression in Estonia, as she has roots there. And she wrote a very good article about exactly this matter, but somewhat more nuanced than Oksana Zabushka, perhaps. You have to think about that. For example, Gogol was a Ukrainian writer. The only reason he didn't write in Ukrainian because he couldn't, so you had to write in Russian. Ilya Repin, another, very Russian painter, is actually Ukrainian. And I think you have to rewind the tape a little and look at it from that point of view. So I don't think it's about Russophobia, but it's more about listening, I think, to what Ukrainian writers and artists are saying at the moment. Although they're very bitter, they're very angry, they're also filled with hate, but you should listen to them a little between the lines.
This is exactly one of the things that we can do. Let's listen to these people now. Carsten, you please.
Yes, before I enter the debate about this essay, I'd like to go back to your first words. Writers who say that they will keep a dignified silence, and I don't see what is the connection between dignity and silence. If the world is burning around you, if democracy is being trampled on, if people are innocent victims of totalitarian forces, how can you keep silent, and what is dignified about it? And this thing about that the muses stay silent when in the vicinity of evil forces. There's a poem by the Russian poet Anna Akhmatova where she sits in the dark winter of Stalinism calling out for the muse, and the muse comes on dark wings and she says to the muse, I bet you were the one who dictated the descriptions of hell to Dante. So there is a muse who knows about darkness, and I think that's what muses do. And concerning this essay, it really hit me very hard. I only read it this morning by accident, and because it went straight into a dilemma I once had. As a journalist, I had been working as a reporter in some wars, and I'm a writer too, and this is back in December 91, and I was in Croatia, your country, reporting on the war, which was a terror war against the civilian population, just as we see it in Ukraine today. And I had been taken to a little village that had been in the hands of Serbian militias for 3 months, and they had then withdrawn after having blown up the 600-year-old Catholic Church. And then the only people left in the village were old people who thought they were harmless, but they were mistaken. They had all been massacred before the militia left. And I was taken through a corridor, the longest corridor of my life, where 48 mutilated bodies were stretched out. They had not been allowed to die in any merciful way. They had been massacred with chainsaws, they had been burned, axes, whatever had been used. And then I was confronted with the man who was responsible for the massacre, because the militia men had been drunk while they committed it, and their captain had fallen asleep, and when they withdrew, they'd forgotten to wake him up. So when he woke up, he was staring down the barrel of a Croatian gun. And these young men who had caught him, young, inexperienced soldiers, presented him to me. And 2 things happened. One thing was that I could see he'd been severely beaten up. And so I asked them, as a journalist, you have to confirm the facts. Did you beat him up? And they said, that's the wrong question. And I said, what is the right question? You should ask us why we haven't killed him. And the answer is because we don't want to be like him. We want him in front of a court when all this is over, which I thought was a very big, dignified answer. But something happened in me confronted with him. You know, I come from a Scandinavian country that hasn't known war for so many years. We were occupied by the Germans, but it was an occupation with gentle hands. And because we didn't resist, to be honest. And so we have a humanism, which is, if we meet evil, we don't believe in it. We think an evil character must have had a bad childhood, you know. And when I was confronted with this man, I thought to myself, I don't give a fuck if he's had a bad childhood. I know only one thing: men like that must be stopped at all costs. And the only language they understand is weapons. And later, I went back again and again to that episode. And I wrote a journalistic piece that was like that, quite propagandistic, quite, a call to arms. But later I thought, if I had been a novelist who had described him just like the monster he was, I would have been a bad novelist. I had to understand him as a novelist, because I think novels are an invitation to the reader to empathize with people who are not you, who are very different from you. And that means even trying to understand evil, which is not the same as apologizing for evil. There is an animal I have been very fascinated by, which is a rat living in Eastern Africa, called the naked rat. And the naked rat lives so deep underground in the tunnels it dig itself that there's no oxygen. And it has developed a method of living for up to more than 30 minutes without oxygen. And I think in a way writers must be able to do the same. We must be this, it's called the naked rat. It's a very ugly rat with no fur at all. And I think we must be naked rats on occasions, able to go into the deepest recesses of the human mind and try to understand. And when I go back to Dostoevsky, I don't think he apologized the murderers. In Crime and Punishment, he tries to understand his main character. And if you go to a novel like, I don't know what it's called in English, I think it's called Demons or Obsession, where there's Stavrokin, who is the incarnation of evil. Dostoevsky does not try to empathize with him. He does not apologize for Stavrokin, because there are always greats of evil. And I think it's part of the difficult challenge of the novel to try to understand how complex human beings are.
Yeah, thank you. Much has been said, but I would like to shift a little bit more in the focus of my discussion to a most vulnerable community all over Europe, and in this case, of course, to the current situation, what is happening. And I do represent the Romani writers and the Romani writers' views in arts and literature. And of course, I'll be discussing this issue into 3 levels: integrating literature, language, and culture / identity. What is currently happening, and of course we've been following all this situation, knowing that Romani people are, wherever the ball is thrown, they're in the middle. And they should now choose which side, the father or the mother, never knowing who's the father or who's the mother. And that's where our identity comes into question. Of course, we know that Romani population in Russia, they've had a great history in that land. They've been progressed in many ways, intellectually in every kind of way. And what we're expecting now is clarifying the identity. It is, of course, when a country is set that you're treated now, okay, you're first Russian in this case, then Roma. But now you have to clarify whether you're Russian or Roma, whether you're Ukrainian or Roma, right? So who do you want to be with? And I can definitely reflect to our fresh past, although not really fresh, but still. We like to justify it. It's been like 20 years, we're still fresh, but when we want to justify the regress of the country, we say, we just, fresh, we just came out of war, which still we really should progress on that sense. But I definitely see the relationship into that, because of course with our continuous cooperation with either writers or civil activists into both countries, of course with European Roma Arts Institute of Culture having the great role in that. We see and we try to get the reflections of the Romani people from the grassroots, of course being interpreted by writers or translators. And this is where the language comes into place. I, as a linguist, I've been recently analyzing everything, and I think here is the question where the dangerous multilingualism comes into place. Because of course the Romani speak Russian in their Romani language. Of course they speak Ukrainian in their Romani language. And then in between these dangerous multilingualism, there's also this code language that nobody understands and nobody actually wanted to understand, right? Which I was criticizing all over the world. Like why I should speak, and it's of course mandatory to speak the language of the country, but not on my co-citizens. You can count them, in hands, that speaks my language. And now that's the dangerous side that is being kind of judged by the country itself. They speak a language that not everybody understands, so let's make it clear. How will they portray that? How will they speak about it? And then, of course, the greatest hand is in literature. And of course, our literature, when saying our literature, I mean the literature written in Romani, is quite poor. And we've been portrayed into this international literature as bad, in every kind of sense. And with our inability in replying and seeing actually what the real picture is, there is this confusion that comes with identity, language, and culture, all put into literature. And what I think and what we are actually trying to speak and, of course, motivate the writers in both countries is that we want to have many diaries of madmen. And we want to have many diaries of Roma mad people there. And I'm sure they won't be heard because of this code language and because of this dangerous multilingualism that I say all the time. We are trying to push and motivate that the Romani story, the Romani grief is being heard by Romani himself, and without being judged on how has been said and what has been said. With all this in mind, I do expect that not only this war, but what I'm recently doing is I'm trying to bring up the story of the Romani story of the Holocaust in general, and let alone all the wars that are happening in between. So they have never been told by the Romani eye. They've never been, or seldom have been told by the Romani pen. And what we are trying as the international Romani community writers is that we want to promote this original Romani story told from both countries, from Roma themselves, without being implied by any party. Because I think that's the clearest picture that can be given for the most vulnerable community all over the world, and that's the purest picture that can be given for most vulnerable community all around the world.
Thank you. So, yes, thank you very much. So, basically, we discussed the role of Ukrainian writers. We mentioned we can't speak from their point of view, but also what can we do as writers? Daniel, you have been active, as you told me, in many events. So could you tell us, throughout these gruesome times, tell us a little bit about initiatives, about the project that have been organized in Sweden and that you participated in?
Well, I used to work as a sort of cultural bureaucrat, or whatever you want to call it, at something called the Swedish Institute. I quit like 7-8 years ago, but I used to work a lot with also Western Balkans, but with Ukraine and Russia. So we had a lot of projects post-Maidan and post-Euromaidan, when there was this feeling in Ukraine that something could be accomplished here. So we did a lot of more or less crazy projects, touring Swedish-Ukrainian joint literary events around the country, even in Donetsk and places that are really occupied by Russia right now. So I had a lot of contacts left in the country. So when the war broke out, I felt somehow obligated, I would say, to try to, I don't know, do something. So basically we organized some readings around Sweden together with Swedish Pen to basically just give voice to what was happening. So we were trying to collect poems, mainly because it's easier with prose, to translate quickly and to do quick translations, which was, as I told you before, problematic.
Yes.
Because of the lack of translators on first hand. But prior to that, I had to ask my friend Tatjana, who lived in Kiev, then had to flee to Lviv. What can we do? We want to arrange these readings. Does it mean anything? And her reply was quite quick. It was, yes, anything needs or means something right now. Because you feel kind of, who am I doing this for? Is it for myself, my bad conscience? But on the other hand, as I also tried to say before, it somehow links our culture to their culture. And I told the TV reporter before, it's kind of sad that you need a war to open up your eyes for a country or a region or a language sometimes. But right now, I mean, things are happening. I mean, a lot of translations are being done. I think Germany is much more well off with translations from the Ukraine. I don't know about Denmark, but in Sweden it's very sparse, very rare. I mean, Shadan has been translated, Zabushka has been mentioned before. But apart from that, it's very rare. So what can we do? I mean, as writers and translators, I think we can, like this panel, we can talk about it. We can, I think, try to give voice to Ukrainian writers and intellectuals. We can listen to them, although they say crazy things like Zabushka. We can listen to it and try to understand. Perhaps trying to be a good novel writer, to try to live yourself into their point of view. But also, I mean, not turn into Russophobia, I guess. Also that you have a lot of Russian writers right now. I mean, right now Lev Rubinstein is in Stockholm. I think he will not be able to return to Moscow, perhaps. He's stuck in the West because he said too much. So we, of course, need to give our support to the forces in Russia that are still struggling on, really, under these, I mean, horrific circumstances that they have right now in Russia. Yeah, I don't know.
I would like to take over and to talk about what can be done on a personal level and then as a writer. Would you like to say a few more words about what can we do, what can be done to make it more heard, to have more influence, to help?
Well, I don't really have recipes. I just think what you can do as a writer is to lift your voice and try to understand what's going on. And since I basically see the fight for Ukrainian independence as a fight for democracy, that's why I can identify with it. If it was just a fight for Ukrainian nationalism, it wasn't that I wouldn't sympathize, but I would not be so happy about the future, because I think that what unites us here, as Europeans too, and I prefer to see the Ukrainians as Europeans, is that this is a fight we can all unite on agreeing on for democracy. And democracy in Europe is threatened at the moment, not just by Russia, but by right-wing populist movements that you find in almost every European country, and that more or less openly acclaims Putin's Russia, and also, to some extent, get money from Russia. And so I think it's a fight that's going on many sides. And also, when Ukraine was invaded on the 24th of February, the Danish Prime Minister gave a speech where she said how unknown war was in Europe and how for generations there had been no war, completely forgetting about the Balkans that clearly didn't exist for her, completely forgetting that Denmark in the last 20 years has involved itself heavily in 4 wars: Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Libya, and all wars have gone horribly bad. But it is as if it's outside of Europe. People don't really have any real existence. That's war, yes, war in another part of the world. It's not serious. But I do think we also should, on this occasion, look at ourselves critically in the mirror. Because we really need, if we want to defend democracy that is threatened, we need a wake-up call. And I don't think that the sanctions against Russia so far have been very efficient, because yes, maybe there will be an oil embargo 3 months into the war, and the gas, well, will be cold in the winter, and is it really worth having 2 degrees less in your living room to defend democracy? Yes, I think it's worth it. But these are still issues that are not quite clear to a lot of politicians. And I think that's where you can raise your voice and be part of putting pressure on them.
Yes, I would also like to note that while I was preparing, I found an article from 2008. I had to check several times, okay, is this real? Where Carsten, in 2008, wrote that about the need of Europe to say no to Russia and to Putin, otherwise we will have Russians marching again all over Ukraine, exactly as it happened. So you were, I mean, like a visionary. I used Google Translate, but Carsten basically agreed that this is what you said. Am I correct?
Yes, you're correct. The funny thing is I couldn't find the article. I was looking for it everywhere. And now
I will send it to you.
You brought it back to me, I of course started remembering why did I write it. And I wrote it under the impression of the Russian...
2008, guys.
Yes, but that was the year Russia invaded parts of Georgia, South Ossetia, among other places. And I had been to South Ossetia when it was independent, as I had been to Abkhazia on the Black Sea some 10 years before. And I could see that this was the beginning. I really feared it was, and that Ukraine then would be next. So I actually also suggested, already back then, that Ukraine should become a member of NATO. And if it had become, this wouldn't have happened, that's for sure.
Yes.
So I think that if, and I am no connoisseur, I am no expert on Putin or Russia, I would never pretend to be. But I think if you took a real clear look at Putin from the beginning, you could see where it was heading. And why was democracy lost in Russia? I think it was lost because we identified market economy with democracy. So in the 90s, when a ruthless rubber capitalism was introduced in Russia, a lot of people lost everything. And I was in Moscow in '92, and I saw people selling everything in the streets. And this, in the Western media, was celebrated as a triumph of democracy and market economy. But it was not a triumph. It was a discrediting of democracy. And that somehow paved the way for Putin, because he gave back a feeling of social security, of identity, something that a neoliberal market economy was incapable of doing and uninterested in doing. So I think in a way we have, to a certain extent, created this mess for ourselves.
Yes, one thing that basically we all agree on is, and you can also draw the parallel with the very recent Croatian war, is basically one day, we were hanging around with your friends, doing whatever. Yes, there were some rumors about the war, whatever, but really, we had no idea that this was going to happen. So the same thing now when I talk either to my Ukrainian friends or Russian ones, that everybody was shocked that this war was going to happen. Then everybody was in a shock that it happened. So basically we kind of like, we didn't see it. We hadn't seen it happening. This is why it is impressive that you already saw it so clearly and wrote about it. So why is it that things repeat themselves? Why is it that we can't learn anything from our previous mistakes? Would you like to say a few words, either one of you? Get a mic? And then Edis.
I've no answer, but I agree with you. So I invited, for example, Serjan. He's writing since 8 years about the war in Donbass. Yevgenia too, she published two books, and we didn't want to see, or from the official side, we didn't
to identify it sort of
to
officially.
identify. And now, at this moment, we are shocked, and we don't want to know that we could have seen it. I would like to add something to the anti-Russian reflexes. So this was what I observe actually is how this war activates the collective memory. It's in Austria, I think in Germany too, and I can imagine in your countries, the former Yugoslavia, it's kind of re-traumatizing. And it's difficult to decide where they come, but I think these anti-Russian reflexes don't have to do with the actual war, but with this collective memory. I know this from my biography. I was grown up in Linz, near the Czech border, and we had relatives there. There was the Iron Curtain, and it was said there, on the other side, there is the Russian, not the Czech people, but the Russian. So this is really very, very anchored in our memory, and this complicates the situation now, I think, to decide and to take position, and we are very near and very willing to take the anti-Russian position without asking where it comes from.
Yes.
And maybe the demand for silence, I agree with you that we don't need silence at this moment, but maybe it's important to give the space, to open the space for thinking about these questions, for looking behind, it's not our, as writers, it's not our task not our duty to comment the facts, but to question them, and to look what interests are behind, what history is behind them. But this is a long-term perspective, and what to do now actually.
All right, so reflecting on two questions, right? What can we do, and why can't we learn from what has been done? No, nobody has. Well, yes. Okay, let's go from a broader picture. We as a country, we did whatever we could. Of course, a small country with small power, but still we did our best. And also as a society, I wouldn't like to mention the school where I work, but the school where I work, we hosted 2 Ukrainian students, and of course we're trying to support them. Other thing, what I think we should do, or we can do, is start learning Russian, one. Because of course we need to understand the narratives from the bottom itself, and of course being quite far away, we also, because we do have our diaspora there, both Albanian diaspora, Roma diaspora, and if we were to really understand how from the bottom of the heart, and of course knowing that, and by the way, the students that we received, of course they are Albanian diaspora, but the children that don't speak Albanian. And then we struggle now in giving instructions. Of course, some of us came handy some of us that know Serbian, Croatian, and a little bit of Russian, like, let's give instructions. But I definitely think that wherever the diaspora is spread, of course we should try to see how that language functions, and of course embrace this diversity of languages. One thing that is important is, why is this happening, I believe, and I think, is that the less we know about one another, the more these things happen. The very recent project that we had in our school, we had an exchange with students from Bosnia coming to our school, and it was for the first time that youngsters meet Bosniaks, and although we are here, like,
Yes.
very close. And I said, like, why is this happening? Like, why don't you just go a little bit, or you come a little bit, so that we get to know each other? And coming back to the last thing that you said, I think ideology is the problem here. And that's the reason why we can't learn something from what happened, and we're still not learning the lesson. Because I think we support some ideologies that are not quite beneficial for random people. And those ideologies then reflect to the nationalism, to the nation itself, to the country itself, which reflects a bad picture about ordinary people. The moment we stop supporting ideologies and then resist and supporting the real picture of what we know and not what somebody's ideology is, then I think these things may not happen. Of course, I reflect here to both my country as identity, as a nation, but also as in my ethnicity, as a Roma. So I think if these things would have been taken into consideration, we would have a different story and a different picture.
What you said now is linked to the question of language. When I observe now the actual discourses, they are following the logic of war. The language is a military language. In every news I have a general or a major who is explaining me the war.
Yes.
And I think we as writers, we have to ask, to question our language. And we have to form another language alongside.
Yes, well,
which is not following the logic of war. And,
yes.
and
the ideology of war, actually, that is reiterated by this language.
It's an imperialistic and colonialistic language, and we have to write against. Yeah. So this,
Very good.
it seems important to me.
Yes, it is, to use another language. Also, I would like just to touch on, I totally agree with Carsten when he said that, for example, if back in 2008 or 9 or whatever, if Ukraine had become a member of NATO, then this would be somehow now NATO war. Maybe this war would have happened in 2009, we don't know that. But things would definitely be different. Currently, I mean, I also agree with you, and specifically because I'm a Russian translator, as I've told you, and there was a huge fear in Croatia in the beginning of this war because we had two projects, publishers, we planned it 2 years ago. We had no idea, we planned to publish Russian authors. And, but, okay, there was some Russophobia, but not that much when it comes to books. But basically, people put, Ukrainian flags on their Facebook profiles, maybe Twitter, whatever. Then some institutions, they, take to lengths to put lightning in the colors of Ukrainian flag. But what I'm, for example, mad about, and maybe this is because of the situation in Croatia, because this is what actually nags me mostly, because we felt that we were totally alone in this war. We had also embargo on guns. At that time, nothing was happening. Couldn't the institutions that we believed in European Union, I think they could have done so much more than just, let's do the lightning today in the colors of Ukrainian flag, and tomorrow, okay, we have some football championship, let's do football, whatever. So this is like very, very, very superficial, and this makes me mad. On the other hand, on an everyday level, on my work, I see that people from Russia, okay, they are not traveling freely. We don't have planes from Moscow, but they travel either through Serbia or through Istanbul, but they travel. I can assure you, they sell property, they rent boats, they do everything. So basically, I don't see any point in those sanctions. These sanctions they are not. I talked 2 days ago to a Croatian company, let's not name it, that produces something in Ukraine. So I asked them, oh my God, probably it's difficult for you now. No, the production is going like this. Okay, please. Okay, you know. So what's the point, basically? This is what's bothering me. Okay, anyone can join me, please. I have a huge problem with this.
Well, I actually like to go back to something you raised before.
Okay.
Why
yes.
can't we learn from history?
Good. Yes.
And I think there is a very specific reason, and that is 1989, when the wall came down, and there was the American philosopher Francis Fukuyama, who talked about the end of history. That now we have reached a kind of calm waters of history where no big dramatic changes would wait for us behind the corner, where democracy or liberalism had definitely won, and there would be no more huge threats to our way of life. And I think that whether we read Fukuyama or not, we were influenced by this atmosphere. We fell asleep in a way. And so things happened behind our back or right in front of us without we really noticing, because we were so sure we were at the best point in world history. We were the best. And so we couldn't be challenged. And every threat was just minor and we could look away from it. And I think that's the beginning of a fatal loss of historical memory that has made us quite unable to learn from experience. And now, of course, we are waking up. They have never fell asleep in the rest of the world, in the so-called third world. They had wars continuously. Some of them, quite a few of them, were our wars against them. So they never believed in end of history, but we did in the US and in Europe, and we are paying for it now. And then there was this talk about new language. And I do actually think we are here as writers, and I think we should a little bit promote ourselves. So I do think that language does exist in novels. Because I wrote a novel about war, and I did a lot of research. I'd also met a lot of soldiers and heard about their experiences and how they were taught to be soldiers. And they told me the first day in my life as a soldier, the first sentence I heard was, "We will teach you how to kill." And how do you teach a person how to kill? You do it through language too. And in the military they call it the language of distance. And that means you learn to distance yourself from the enemy by degrading him to something less than human, with a number of words. And because he's less than human, it's easier to kill him. And I think the novel is all the opposite of this teaching of distancing yourselves. It's a language of intimacy. It's an inviting language of empathy. You learn to become the other, the one who is not you. You're a man reading about a woman, and somehow you do experience what it's like to be in a woman's body, or vice versa. You're in another historical epoch, or you are, in the enemy's camp. And the French philosopher Simone Weil, reading the Iliad, which is really a huge epic of fighting and bloodlust and killing and defeating. But she drew a lesson from it that I think we still need to learn. She says, what I learned from the Iliad, what you learn when you read it is not to admire the powerful, not to hate your enemy, and not to despise the defeated. And I think that is a lesson that goes forever, and in the wars we are having now. and in the future wars, because this war in Ukraine is not going to be the last, I'm sorry to say.
Thank you so much for those beautiful words. Anybody else would like to comment?
Yes. Maybe to answer to your question.
Yes,
about
please.
the Ukrainian
Get a mic.
flags, yes, it's quite superficial, but I think it shows.
The life is superficial these days, yes.
It shows a lot. So I was astonished too, and I was asking myself, why didn't we have flags when Grozny was bombed, when Aleppo was bombed, when all the wars, the last destinies. And I think that what is to observe now is that we are very unsure about all our self-images. So this war has upsettled all our positions, self-images from Europe, from never war, and all the fragility and vulnerability of the Western civilization, but not only of the Western civilization, but of the human civilization, is now in question. And I think these gests of solidarity by Ukrainian flags is the symbol for saving the rest of. So we are solidary. We defend our values, our democracy, and I think it's a very helpless sign of. I don't know. I have no idea.
Yes, you're right. I'd just like to add one thing that I noticed in Croatia. I don't know about your countries. Is when the war started in Ukraine, and the first week of the war, which was the last week of February, people were acting totally crazy, and that goes hand in hand with what somebody said with this collective memory, because all of us, we had collective memory of quite a recent war. Okay, it's been like 20-something, 30 years, but people were very nervous, agitated. A lot of people called me and said, I don't know, I'm taking pills and stuff. So basically it all came back very quickly, because it happened to us. Okay, 30 years is not a big time, because we are still living this war every day in Croatian social networks or with our neighbors and stuff like that. Yeah, please, it is so very close.
Maybe referring to one of the aspects that has been said, which is the distancing themselves so that you become more like cold towards who is in front of you, which refers to what I actually said, and what we as language teachers or culture teachers as well try to do, is that we try to portray different cultures as close as possible, so that the first side has this clearer and closer picture towards a second culture, and becomes more resistant when it's being taught of being like more cold. And another thing that I'd like to mention is actually the quote that I'll start my reading tomorrow, which my short story starts with, and it relates to vulnerable people in such situations, like in war situation. In this case, people with less political and any kind of power in both places, Russia and Ukraine. But although here it refers with an I of Roma, the quote says, Romani people know how invaders look like, and they never envied them. Meaning, like, of course, yes, you do have the power, you have this physical power, you have the political power, but nobody envies you, right? Everybody just like tries to go out from you, right? So I think that's the kind of a moral we should put forward as writers, as people who deal with culture, as people who deal with performances, actually putting in front the unheard stories from the eyes of those that were unheard.
Yes. Now maybe it's the time to give us some light, and maybe it's the time now for some guest questions from people from audience who would like to jump in. Pietro told me that there will be mics, although if there are no mics, you will just speak a little bit louder. So would anybody like to ask something? Okay, don't be ashamed, I see you in the blue shirt. Do you have a question? Oh, no, I'm kidding. Sorry. So is there anybody that would like to comment or ask some, or anything? Okay. They all agree with what we said. Oh, excellent. Always ladies, yes. Is there a mic? Or you can just...
There is a mic.
There is somewhere.
There should be a mic.
Maybe it's
Always.
Or we can... I don't know if it's...
No, it's.
I think it's on my wall.
Thank you.
Test. Ah, well.
Oh, thank you. I have to. I mean, I was kind of like trying to. I keep repeating myself, don't do it, don't do this, don't ask this question. But well, I had to. I have to first tell you I'm coming from Bosnia and Herzegovina, and in former Yugoslavia, people used to tell that people in Bosnia and Herzegovina are a little bit stupid. So, coming from the stupid people, I have to ask like a very simple question, because being stupid, I don't understand. What democracy is for you people in Europe? When I don't understand. So is it democratic to give a Nobel Award to Peter Handke, a man who openly supports a person that the Western world, not us, we call that man Slobodan Milosevic, but the West call him a Balkan butcher? Is that democracy? Is it democracy when you have 5 people standing in a line to cross the border running away from war? 2 of them are Roma, 3 of them are blonde eyes and blue eyes and blonde hair. You leave a Roma on the side and you let the blonde ones to enter. Is it democracy where your border police push back every day non-white people, telling them you are not refugee, you're not human, or if they let them into democracy, they keep them in concentration camps, because that's what refugee camps are, nothing else than that. Is it democracy to ignore the crimes committed here in Kosovo, the crimes committed in Bosnia? Is it democracy a genocide that you Europeans let happen 30 years ago? Because that's what Dutch soldiers done. That's what UN done in Bosnia. You let us die for your democracy. And now, for no reason, you're telling, not you, as a panel, but the Western world is telling me, oh, we are defending democracy. Is it democracy only what white people with the blonde hair and blue eyes can live, and we others who are not that white enough, I don't know what is white enough or not, we are not allowed to live? Do we have to hear a person saying that Peter Handke is good in 2022 when he tried to kill every single person in the city where you are talking about Peter Handke? Is that democracy? Are you ashamed of yourself? Are you ashamed that when we are talking here in Austria, in Denmark, in Sweden, in Croatia especially, the border police is brutally beating up somebody because he or she is from Afghanistan, from Africa, from Syria, from wherever? Is it democracy when in, let's say in Denmark, when a person from Syria tried to enter as a refugee, you take his belongings? Because that's what is happening in democracy. So I'm really, but again, I have to tell you, I'm Bosnian, I survived the war, so they took out like half of my brain is like probably, I'm like it's lobotomy. I'm a genocide survivor. I was not worth of saving, and because of this I'm very stupid. So I have no, and sorry for this, I have no fucking idea what democracy is when I hear it, the word coming from the West. I'm sorry, I had to do it.
I used it in an ironic sense. I used it, the word in an ironic sense, because it's an actual discourse to the people say, now we have to defend our
Let's take
democracy.
microphone, please.
That's the narrative which we hear now. It's not my opinion.
No, I must be
Yeah.
better on the West.
And I feel ashamed.
I I hope you don't consider Croatia the West, because we are definitely not the West. And that is why I cannot be so ashamed as these other guys. What our border police does is horrible. Whatever
You are
happens
West.
in Croatia, no, we are not. Only just administratively. What happens on the borders of Croatia is horrible. What happens inside the Croatia is horrible, because we have never been so corrupted. The best part of Croatia was the part when we had to pretend that we are doing everything to please European Union and to assess European Union. After that, if somebody told me, please don't film me, I will have... I'm kidding. If somebody told me that in 2012 that things were going to change like this, I would say, no. Like the war in Ukraine, no. It's impossible. It's impossible. We are on a wonderful highway to some beautiful future. No, hell. So, it's horrible.
Okay, so perhaps I feel obliged to answer the question about
You
Peter
are blonde,
Handke.
because you are blonde, I suppose.
Yeah,
yes,
yes.
you have to do it.
I'm the West, so listen to
You're the
on the
blonde.
voice.
So I could be saved, don't I?
Yeah. But about Peter Handke and the Swedish Academy, of course. Yes, is that democracy? Yes, I would say that. I don't agree with the Swedish Academy that the Nobel Prize should be awarded Peter Handke. I don't agree with that. But on the other hand, the Swedish Academy is an institution that has no funding from the state whatsoever. It's a free institution that can give away its awards to anyone it wants to. And from that point of view, perhaps that's democratic. I don't know. As I said, I don't agree with the choice, and I was also organizing debates about this prize together with Swedish Pen, and we had, people from the Western Balkans also giving witness to what happened here after the prize and so on. But maybe we're naive, I guess, in countries like ours, in Scandinavia, for example, where we haven't had war for such a long time. And we have this stupid belief that people can make choices. I don't know, I lost the thread. But there is a danger in our part of the world, like you're implying, Carsten, and as you said, refugees coming to Denmark, they take their belongings, rings, jewelry, money, and so on. There was a time when there was a bigger openness in my part of the world. I grew up with that. And something has shifted, and I think that's it's becoming more and more undemocratic in many ways. The message that I hear in my public media, I feel is orchestrated by thoughts much more to the far right than to the left or the center, which is a huge, huge problem for democracy, I would say. I wouldn't like to answer the question what democracy is. I'll stop there.
Well, to start with Peter Handke, the Nobel Prize Foundation is not a democratic foundation. It's not a referendum that decides who's going to get the prize. It was created by a man who produced dynamite, and he wanted us to see him as a benefactor of humanity. And so we created Nobel Prize Institution, but that you can protest against his choices and say they are shit choices, that's democracy. That you are not then being picked up by the police or being silenced in other ways. But I think that what you are describing is that democracy is falling apart, that it's becoming increasingly populist, racist, full of discrimination, and my own country, that if you travel around the world, people look admiring at you as if you come with a passport from paradise. But we are becoming one of the worst countries in Europe. We are sending back Syrian refugees, claiming that there's peace in Syria and that Assad will shake their hand and say, welcome back, friends. He will send them to jail where they'll be tortured to death. And Danish politicians don't give a shit. And this law about confiscating belongings, which was basically jewelry, it has never been used. But it was not the intention. The intention was to give a signal, we'll take away your dignity when you arrive here. Because to us, you are people without dignity. You are subhuman because you come from other parts of the world. You are Muslims. You have a dark skin. And right now, we are working on a law that will send back asylum seekers reaching Denmark will be sent to camps in Rwanda, a dictator state, and they can rot up there while we decide not to give them asylum. And Boris Johnson, another threat to democracy, has already stolen that law and made it a law, but he was inspired by Denmark. And I'm glad you know about Denmark, because otherwise I would have to take away all your illusions. Don't have any illusions about Denmark. And we have...
1992.
We have...
Of the war in Bosnia.
Sorry?
My illusions died in 1992.
Yes.
When I woke up in the war in Sarajevo.
Yeah.
No
I mean,
illusions.
but your illusions about Europe could have
No, I
died
don't
in
care.
'92 because we didn't really care.
Yeah.
We didn't do anything. And like you say, the United Nations Peace Corps was there to protect themselves. The only thing they they worried about, was if some of their soldiers were taken hostage. And they didn't move a finger to protect Muslims in Srebrenica and so on. There are so many failures of democracy. But still, democracy hasn't gone yet, and I still think it's worth standing up and fighting for it. Because if somebody doesn't, it will just be eroded away, and then what will we have? A new authoritarian era, and in many places it seems to be coming. And the problem is that we have politicians who are opportunistic, who are in the hands of lobbies from big industry, the neoliberal market economy, who is not interested in democracy, who just pretends that market economy in itself is democracy, which it isn't. And so I think you're pointing out some very real present dangers to democracy right now. And there's way too few people crying out about it, raising their voices. And that, among many others, could be a job for writers, but it's a job for everybody. In that way, I think the writer should see him or herself as a democratic citizen. And with being a citizen in a democracy, there is a lot of duties. Doesn't come for free. It's not a given that you will always have these rights. You have to stand up and fight for them, not just for yourself, but for those who cannot defend themselves and who doesn't have a voice. And sometimes that is the job of the writer, to give voice to those who are voiceless.
Yes, I just wanted to reflect to that. Of course, the role of the writers, of course, not blaming we or them, but I think that's our greatest role, to give the voice of unvoiced, to question exactly everything you questioned. So I think we as writers, translators, as people who deal with pen have this powerful pen knowledge and way of putting them into word and then questioning, putting in front of the faces of the people who didn't hear those stories. I think that's what we can do, and that's the powerful tool we have. Both, for example, all the wars that have happened, you called, like, yes, there is this prejudice, Bosnians, right? And you can imagine what was the prejudice about Albanians. How many Albanian stories have not been heard, let alone how many Roma words or stories have not been heard about the previous war that we are in. And we are still struggling putting them forward as country, as nation, as ethnicity, whatever. So of course, I agree with everything, and therefore we should treat ideology and fight it back with the words that we put on the letters. And I think that's the most powerful tool we can have as writers.
Alida, where is the mic?
For me, it was very interesting a moment as you, Carsten, told us that in the free 90s in Russia it was very, very deep moment as Soviet Union was gone, and after perestroika the Russians were very, very poor. I was 89 in Moscow, directly after perestroika in Moscow and Petersburg, and I also saw this incredible poverty and disappear, and it was really terrible moment. And you told very important words. They answer also somehow on these questions, what is democracy? That in this moment the world, and also Russians, but also the world, changed the idea of democracy with change of neoliberalism and of capitalism, of this really hard capitalism. And that is what happened in all our countries. In all our countries we have idea of democracy changed with idea of capitalistic market and free market. And what I saw in Croatia, but also in all our countries, it was we have no democracy, we have Lidl and telecom and these things. And that was in our opinion, we are now Western, but it is really, really terrible. And this moment, Western world betrayed us. But we allowed it also. Now for too many years, we accept this betrayal. And both sides are betrayed through neoliberalism, through idea that that is democracy. Because free market, oh, it's freedom, but it's only free market and not totally freedom. And now we see end of this world somehow, not end of the history like Fukuyama saw it, but end of this illusion. And in this moment, not only people in the West, in democratic countries, but we in false democratic countries, we really have to try to be really democratic now. And also on your question with the Western world, of course, the Western world was not interested, was not capable to save Croatia, Bosnia, Kosovo. That was not their issue. They only wanted to have, okay, those Balkans, let us have the problem with them solved, but they were not interested. We have to do something for us. We have to do everybody. And then we are on the point, yes, what can do writers, but also what can do citizens. I know it from Croatia. Nobody likes to join a party, I don't know, good party, Green Party, or some leftist party, I don't know, and to do something. Nobody. Everybody is writing in Twitter, on Facebook, how shit the life is, but nobody is active in political way. But it's not possible to change it. So it's not possible. And another thing you told, and I found it great, this knowing each other. We really didn't know each other in Yugoslavia. We was on a very small, that is a real small country, but we have no trains. The trains, Europe ended where trains are not running, and we have no trains, we have no good autobahn and things, and we didn't know each other. And it is like this, Tanya came from Split to Pristina via Vienna or something. It's no plane, no train, no streets, nothing. From Split to Pristina. You know, from Paris to Berlin you can go, I don't know, with trains, with autos, with anything. So there are problems that we have to solve for us. And this is very, very important issue. We don't know each other. For my person, I studied as a Croat in Serbia. It was great for me, and I'm happy that I did it. But I don't know many Croats who did it, and I don't know any Serb who did it to study in Zagreb. No, nobody. It was not in my time. I'm old, but in Yugoslavia time. Nobody did it. in so small country, and it is till today. Why not study in another of these countries, you know? But we don't do it. So there are maybe some solutions in these ways.
Okay, anybody else? And if not, I would like to end on a note. I would like to just, I don't know if you know the Ukrainian initiative that was started by writer or editor Irina Maturevich. She was the co-founder of this portal Chitamo, and I think it was a portal that before the war was about the books, reviews and stuff like that, but immediately as the war started, they just started translating everything in English from Ukraine, and the translations are very good, and they gave room to Ukrainian writers, journalists, artists, so you can maybe check it, and there is a lot to be learned from there. It's spelled CHYTOMO, and there is a lot of really good materials in English, so we can actually start getting to know each other, as Alida said. And we need to remember, I think that the stories carry the truth of things. So we need to, as writers and authors and the combinations, you need to write your stories, we will translate your stories. Because if you don't do that, then we will have, as I said in the beginning, the horrendous, which is going to definitely become the truth. So we can do what we can. Basically, the stories are immune to the strongmen and nuts, such as Putin. So I would like to end on this note. Thank you, Edis. Thank you, Petra. Thank you, Daniel. Thank you, Carsten. And thank you, guys, for being with us here.
Can I end reading a poem?
Yes.
Oh, it's not a poem I've written. It's a poem by the Russian writer Anna Akhmatova,
Oh, perfect.
which I think simply suits this situation we've had here today, the debate we've had so perfectly. And both her son and her husband was in prison. And she was part of a lot of women who every day stood in front of the prison gate, searching for news about their beloved ones. And then this little episode happens. In the fearful years of the Chekhov terror, I spent 17 months in prison queues in Leningrad. One day, somebody identified me. Beside me in the queue, there was a woman with blue lips. She had, of course, never heard of me. But she suddenly came out of that trance so common to all of us and whispered in my ear. Everybody spoke in whispers here. Can you describe this? And I said, yes, I can. And then something like the shadow of a smile crossed what had once been her face. And I hope you will leave with the shadow of a smile crossing your faces.